In 1990, a young man named William Morgan was working an ordinary job, living an ordinary life, when his parents sat him down and told him they had found the truth. They had become Jehovah's Witnesses. And from that moment, whether William realized it or not, the pressure was already building. He was in his early 20s. He had no particular crisis. He was not lost. But his parents were now inside a world that operated by a specific set of rules about who you associated with and how closely. And William was on the outside of it. Nobody threatened him directly. Nobody issued an ultimatum. What happened was subtler than that. The warmth available when he leaned toward the organization, and the quiet distance when he didn't. He would later call it soft shunning. And it worked. Within 4 years of his baptism, William Morgan had become a pioneer, one of the most demanding volunteer roles in the organization. He was good at it, he believed it, and he believed it enough that when the invitation came to leave everything behind and move to Bethel, the Watchtower Society's sprawling headquarters complex in Wallkill, New York, he said yes without hesitation. He spent 6 years there. He worked the land, operated heavy machinery, attended every meeting, lived inside the institution he had been taught to revere, and what he found there, in the archive, in the conversations with leadership, and eventually in the ground beneath his feet, would cost him his parents, his community, and every relationship he had built inside that world. This is what he found. And this is what he did about it. To understand why William Morgan became a Jehovah's Witness, you have to start with his parents. They had converted before him. They were already inside the organization when William was still on the outside looking in. And the thing about having Jehovah's Witness parents when you are not yet a member yourself is that the distance is felt before anyone ever names it. Not through arguments, not through ultimatums, through something quieter and harder to defend against. The way a conversation opens up when you show interest in what they've found, and the way it closes down, just slightly, when you don't. The warmth that's available in one direction and not quite the same in the other. William would later call this soft shunning, the withdrawal of closeness before anyone has officially left, or in his case, before anyone has officially arrived. It is a mechanism the organization does not advertise, but does not need to. It operates through ordinary human beings doing ordinary human things, loving their family members more freely when those family members are moving toward the organization, and pulling back, almost imperceptibly, when they aren't. It worked on William the way it works on most people in his position. He started studying. He went to meetings. He absorbed the theology and the culture together, the way you always do when the two arrive delivered by people you love. He was intelligent, and he was earnest, and he was watching his parents be happier when he leaned in. After the required period of study and preparation, he stood up in front of a congregation and was baptized. He was in his mid-20s. He was now officially a member. And the organization he had just joined had very specific plans for what kind of member he was going to become. What the organization expected of its members, William Morgan delivered, and then exceeded. The baseline requirement for a committed Jehovah's Witness is substantial. Regular meeting attendance, consistent participation in field ministry, ongoing personal study, and the kind of behavioral standards that touch almost every area of daily life. Most members meet these requirements and go no further. That is considered acceptable. But the organization also has a tier above ordinary membership, a layer of voluntary commitment that it calls pioneering, and that requires a significant minimum of hours each month spent actively preaching, conducting Bible studies, and working the door-to-door ministry that is the organization's most visible public face. William became a pioneer within 4 years of his baptism. That is a rapid ascent by any measure. He was organized, disciplined, persuasive, and genuinely motivated. He was not going through motions. He had made a decision about what his life was for, and he was executing that decision with the same seriousness that he brought to everything else. The community around him recognized it. His reputation inside the congregation grew. He was the kind of person an organization like this notices, and the Watchtower Society noticed. The invitation to serve at Bethel arrived, and with it came a set of expectations that William needed to understand before he accepted. Bethel is not a posting you negotiate. It is not a job with benefits and exit options and the kind of professional distance that separates an employee from an employer. It is a total commitment. Bethel workers, called Bethelites, live on the property, eat in the communal dining hall, attend meetings together, work assigned shifts, and submit to the standards of conduct that the organization maintains across the facility. They receive a small monthly stipend, enough to cover personal expenses. In exchange, they give the organization their labor, their time, their obedience, and their presence, around the clock, for as long as their assignment lasts. For a true believer, none of that is a deterrent. It is the point. To be invited to give everything to an institution you believe is directed by God is not a sacrifice. It is an honor. William packed what he was permitted to bring, which was not much, and drove to Wallkill, New York. He was 26 years old, he believed completely in what he was doing, and he was about to spend 6 years discovering that the institution he had given his life to was not what it had told him it was. The Wallkill property is not what most people imagine when they think of a religious headquarters. It is not a cathedral complex or a cluster of administrative offices. It is an industrial and agricultural operation on a significant scale. Hundreds of acres that include working farms, large printing facilities, warehouses, dormitories, and the full infrastructure of a self-sustaining community. The presses at Wallkill have produced billions of pieces of Watchtower literature. The organization's reach into hundreds of countries passes through operations based on properties like this one. William was assigned to the farms and construction side of the operation. He operated heavy machinery, worked on building projects, and spent his days in the physical infrastructure that kept the compound running. This was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of assignment that put him in regular contact with the governing body or the upper levels of organizational leadership. But it put him inside the property, living the daily life of Bethel. And that daily life turned out to be something the organization's literature did not quite prepare him for. The schedule at Bethel was controlled in a way that he had not experienced anywhere else. Time was managed in increments of 15 minutes. The day was structured from wake up to lights out, and deviation from that structure was visible immediately in a community where everyone lived, worked, ate, and worshiped together. There was no commute home at the end of a shift. There was no personal time that existed outside the organization's view. The dormitory room he was assigned, shared with 4 other men, had no real privacy either. The housekeepers who maintained the facility had unrestricted access to every room and every personal belonging inside it. This last point mattered more than it might sound. If a Bethelite was found in possession of anything the organization considered inappropriate, music, books, films, anything that carried the flavor of the world outside, the consequences were serious. People were careful. People were watched. And people watched each other, not necessarily out of malice, but because the social environment of Bethel made everyone aware, at all times, that the standards applied everywhere, and that the community itself was the enforcement mechanism. You were never fully off duty. William adapted to this. He had come to Bethel to serve, not to be comfortable, and he approached the demands of the place with the same discipline that had made him a standout pioneer. But the thing about living that close to an institution is that you begin to see it clearly. The face it shows from the outside, polished by decades of carefully managed public communication, does not survive proximity. And William was now very close indeed. One of the things that William had expected from Bethel was an encounter with a different quality of leadership. The governing body, the small group of men who claimed to function as God's exclusive channel of communication on earth, were not abstract figures from a distance anymore. They were men he could observe, men he shared a compound with, men whose actual behavior in the daily life of the institution was visible to anyone paying attention. He paid attention. What he saw was not what he had been prepared for. He had expected unusual spiritual depth. He had expected the kind of transparent integrity and evident wisdom that you would reasonably expect from men who claimed a direct line to the creator of the universe. What he observed instead was the ordinary behavior of powerful men inside a powerful institution. Internal politics, organizational ego, the familiar dynamics of hierarchy and self-interest that appear in every human institution, regardless of what the institution claims about itself. These were administrators, executives. They made decisions the way executives make decisions, on the basis of organizational interest, institutional momentum, and the kind of practical calculation that has nothing to do with divine guidance. This alone was disorienting. But it was still possible, at this stage, to tell himself that imperfect men could still serve as instruments of something larger than themselves. The Watchtower's own theology allowed for this, the idea that God uses imperfect humans to accomplish his purposes. So William held the cognitive dissonance and kept working. He attended his meetings, he did his shifts, he performed the daily life of Bethel. And then a colleague mentioned the library. The Bethel facility maintained an extensive archive of historical Watchtower publications. Every magazine the organization had ever printed, every book, every study guide, every doctrinal statement going back to the 19th century. It was, from a purely research standpoint, an extraordinary collection. From the standpoint of a Jehovah's Witness beginning to ask questions about the organization's history, it was something else entirely. William began spending time there. He was not yet looking for anything specific, but he noticed, early on, that the books had been read before him. Faint pencil marks appeared in the margins of old publications, deliberate annotations left by previous researchers, pointing to specific passages, specific dates, specific claims. Somebody had been here before him, working through the same material, noting the same things. He followed the marks. The Watchtower Society had been making predictions about the end of the world since its founding. Not vague, hedged predictions, specific ones. Dates, years, promises, made in print, distributed to millions of members around the world, telling them that Armageddon was imminent, that the dead would be resurrected by a specific point in time, that the system of things was about to end. The year 1914. The year 1925. The expectations built around 1975. Each one announced with complete authority, each one arriving and passing without the events that had been promised, and each one subsequently explained away, reframed, absorbed into new theological language, buried beneath the next version of the doctrine, without ever acknowledging what had actually happened. The organization's claim to authority rested on a specific story about itself, that it was the faithful channel through which God had been progressively revealing truth across the generations, that its doctrinal development was not error and correction, but illumination, a gradual brightening of understanding guided by divine hand. The history in that library told a different story. It told the story of an institution that had been wrong, repeatedly and catastrophically, about the most important claims it had ever made, and had developed an institutional reflex for making each failure disappear. William sat with this. He cross-referenced. He read the original words, not summaries, not explanations from apologists, but the actual sentences that had been printed and distributed to people who had reorganized their lives around what those sentences promised. The foundation of everything he had built his adult life on was not what he had been told it was. But he still had one question he needed to ask out loud. And when he got the answer, it closed something permanently. The Watchtower Society's theology rests on a specific mechanism of authority. The organization teaches that among its members there exists a group known as the anointed, those who believe themselves called to heaven, among the 144,000 described in the book of Revelation. These anointed ones are identified in Watchtower theology as the faithful and discreet slave of Matthew chapter 24. And it is through this group, the organization teaches, that God communicates new spiritual understanding to his people on earth. New doctrine, what the organization calls new light, flows from God, through the anointed, to the governing body, and from the governing body to the global membership. That is the chain of authority. That is the justification for why the governing body's interpretations of Scripture are binding on every Jehovah's Witness on earth. While William was at Bethel, the organization issued a significant revision to one of its most important doctrines. The teaching about the generation of 1914, the cornerstone claim that tied the timing of Armageddon to the generation of people alive when the organization said Christ's invisible rule had begun, had become impossible to sustain as that generation aged out of existence. The revision was presented the way all such revisions are presented, as new light, a deepened understanding granted by God to his faithful representatives. William went and found the anointed members living and serving at Bethel. He asked each of them the same question. Had they been consulted? Had they participated in developing this new doctrinal understanding? Had they received this revision through any channel that differed from an ordinary member sitting in a kingdom hall anywhere else in the world? Every single one of them said no. A magazine had arrived. They had opened it. They had read the new teaching at the same time as everyone else. Not one of the people whose spiritual authority was being used to validate the revision had been involved in producing it. The new light had reached the anointed members of God's channel of communication on earth, the same way it reached a retired school teacher in rural Ohio. In the mail. William understood exactly what this meant. The governing body was not receiving insight from the anointed and translating it into doctrine. It was making decisions, organizational, theological, practical decisions, and then using the theological concept of the anointed as a retrospective justification for authority it had simply taken for itself. The faithful and discreet slave was not a spiritual reality operating behind the scenes. It was a label applied after the fact to decisions made by a small group of men who answered to no one. He went back to his shift. He attended the next meeting. He kept his face arranged correctly. But something had ended, and he knew it. And not long after, working on an ordinary day in the grounds of the Wallkill property, he saw what ended everything else. Industrial printing at the scale the Wallkill facility operates requires significant quantities of chemical compounds, inks, solvents, lubricants, cleaning agents. The materials that keep large presses running are not household products. Most of them are classified as hazardous waste under United States law. The regulations governing their disposal exist for a straightforward reason. These compounds do not stay where you put them. They move through soil. They reach water tables. They enter the groundwater that communities depend on. The regulatory framework around hazardous waste disposal is not bureaucratic inconvenience. It is the outcome of documented cases where improper disposal caused serious, lasting, and in some cases irreversible harm to real people. William was working in the operational areas of the Wallkill property when he saw what was being done with some of these materials. Drums of printing solvent, the kind that federal and state law required to be transported to certified disposal facilities and processed through approved channels, were being buried on the property, in the ground, without the regulatory process that the law mandated. The logic of the decision was not difficult to understand. Certified hazardous waste disposal costs money. Burial costs almost nothing. And so the organization, whose publications describe Jehovah's Witnesses as responsible stewards of the earth, whose literature spoke of a coming paradise where creation would be restored, was cutting operational costs by putting toxic industrial chemicals into the soil above local water tables and leaving them there. William had read the failed prophecies. He had heard the anointed members describe receiving new light in the mail. He had watched the governing body operate like a corporate executive team while claiming to speak for God. And now he was standing in a field watching drums of solvent go into the ground on a property the organization presented to the world as a house of God. He had his answer, every version of it, and he was done. Reporting the organization to a government regulatory body was not a decision William Morgan made in a moment of anger. He understood with complete clarity what it would cost him. His parents were inside this world. Every friendship of any depth he had built across nearly a decade of adult life was inside it. The congregation that had celebrated his baptism, the colleagues who worked alongside him at Bethel, the entire social infrastructure of his existence, all of it belonged to an institution that had a specific name for what he was about to do. Not whistleblowing. Apostasy. In the theology and culture of Jehovah's Witnesses, going to outside authorities with information that damages the organization is not treated as a civic act. It is treated as a spiritual betrayal of the highest order. Choosing the world system over Jehovah's organization, siding with Satan against God's people. The consequences for this, within the community, are total. Formal disfellowshipping means that every Jehovah's Witness in your life is required to cut contact with you. Friends, colleagues, and family. The policy makes no exception for parents. He knew all of this. He had watched it applied to others. He understood the mechanism precisely. He contacted the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation anyway. He gave the DEC what he had, the nature of the materials, the location of the burial sites, the operational details that only someone physically present could provide. He gave them documentation. He gave them maps. He gave them a first-hand account specific enough to act on. The investigation proceeded. The contamination was confirmed. The extent of what had been buried became part of the official environmental record of the state of New York. The Watchtower Society was required to undertake a formal remediation, a legally mandated, professionally managed cleanup operation that addressed the contamination William Morgan had brought to official attention. The cost ran into millions of dollars. The documentation is public. The search terms, Watchtower Sawmill Place Remediation, return the PDFs, the assessments, the maps of what was found and where. It is not hidden. It is sitting in the public record, available to anyone willing to look. Inside the organization, the response to William's disclosure was faster and less formal. The shunning policy of Jehovah's Witnesses is not a cultural tendency or an informal social response. It is a written, enforced, deliberately maintained organizational policy. When a member is disfellowshipped or formally disassociates from the organization, every other Jehovah's Witness, including family members, is required to cut off contact with that person. The theological framing is that this protects the congregation's spiritual purity and gives the disfellowshipped person a reason to return. The practical effect is that it makes leaving the organization catastrophically expensive in human terms, and does so deliberately. William's parents received the same instruction every other Jehovah's Witness in his life received. They followed it. They sent him a letter. It was written in the measured language of people executing a policy they have been told comes from God. Careful, not hostile, with the particular quality of finality that belongs to decisions that have been made in advance by someone else. The letter told him that they would no longer be treating him as their son. He had chosen the world. He had rejected Jehovah's organization. The loving and scripturally correct response, as the Watchtower defines it, was to withdraw. His parents were not cruel people. This point matters, and William has been consistent about it. They were people inside a system that had defined this action as love, that had convinced them, through years of teaching and social reinforcement, that cutting off their son was the spiritually faithful thing to do. The organization had built the architecture. His parents were living inside it. And the result, regardless of the intentions involved, was that William Morgan lost his family. Not in the way that estrangement happens in ordinary families, where time and effort can sometimes rebuild what broke. In the specific, enforced, policy-mandated way that the Watchtower Society constructs these separations, with a letter, a line, and no path back that doesn't require his return to the organization. He had reported toxic waste dumping to state environmental authorities. He had told the truth about what he witnessed. And the consequence, in the world he had inhabited for nearly a decade, was that his parents were gone. The disfellowshipping process inside Jehovah's Witnesses is not dramatic. There is no confrontation at the door, no shouting. What happens is quieter, and in many ways, worse. An announcement is made at the Kingdom Hall, a single sentence stating that the person in question is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. From that moment, every member is expected to treat that person as though they do not exist. No greetings, no phone calls, no response to messages. People who spent years sitting next to you, studying with you, celebrating milestones with you, will walk past you in a parking lot and look straight ahead, not out of hatred, out of obedience to a policy they have been told is God's requirement. William had watched this happen to other people while he was still inside. He had seen the announcement made, seen the person disappear from the social fabric of the congregation overnight, seen the remaining members adjust without visible grief, because the theology frames the shunning as an act of love rather than punishment. He knew exactly what the mechanism looked like from the inside. Now he was on the other side of it. The colleagues from Bethel went quiet. The friends from the congregation went quiet. The people who had known him for nearly a decade, who had watched him pioneer and serve and give 6 years of his life to the organization's headquarters, went quiet in the specific and total way that the policy requires. One by one and then all at once, the social world he had built inside the organization simply closed around the space where he had been and carried on. What was left was the letter from his parents and a life that had to be rebuilt from a foundation that no longer existed. He has children now, and the decisions he has made about how to raise them have been built directly out of what he lost and how he lost it. He uses the word firewall, a boundary designed to prevent a specific harm from crossing from one system into another. His children will not be baptized into an organization that holds their relationships hostage to their compliance. They will not grow up in a world where changing your mind about theology costs you your family. The mechanism that started with his own parents, that shaped the invisible pressure of his conversion, that executed the removal of everyone he knew when he told the truth, that mechanism ends with him. He has been clear about this, not as triumph, as a decision about what he is responsible for. He is also still living with what he carries. His parents are alive. They do not speak to him. That is not a metaphor or a dramatic device. It is his actual daily life, years after the letter arrived, years after the organization made its announcement, and the world he had inhabited closed itself off. The Watchtower Society created that outcome through a policy it wrote, enforces, and defends in courts across multiple countries. William's parents are the people who executed it. The distinction matters to him, and he has been consistent about making it. What he does with what he carries is keep talking. He has spoken publicly and in detail about all of it. The library, the anointed members, the drums, the call to the DEC, the letter, All of it. Not because it's comfortable, because the organization functions, at every level, on the assumption that the people who know things will calculate the cost and stay quiet. William Morgan calculated the cost. He knew exactly what it was. And he talked anyway. Near the end of a long recorded conversation with journalist Lloyd Evans, William Morgan was asked what advice he would give to a Jehovah's Witness who was beginning to have doubts. The answer he gave was short, precise, and entirely serious despite the irony in it. If you want to remain a Jehovah's Witness, he said, do not research. Do not go into the archive and look at what the organization published in 1914, in 1925, in 1975, and what it promised would happen. Do not ask the anointed members how they received the new doctrinal understanding that their authority is used to validate. Do not look at what is buried in the ground on the organization's own property, because if you apply to your own faith the same standard of evidence you would apply to any other claim, if you simply look at what is actually there, you will not be able to stay. He is not exaggerating. The archive exists. The failed prophecies are in it, in the organization's own printed words. The anointed members at Bethel exist. Their answer about the new light, that they got it in the mail, same as everyone else, is the answer they gave. The drums exist. The DEC investigation exists. The remediation exists. The public documents exist, accessible to anyone with a search engine and 30 seconds. None of this requires trusting a critic or an apostate, or anyone with a declared agenda against the organization. It requires only the willingness to look at what is already there, already documented, already sitting in the public record. William Morgan spent 6 years at the operational center of the Watchtower Society. He was not a skeptic running an investigation. He was a true believer doing the work he had committed to do, working the land, operating the machines, attending every meeting, living inside the institution he had devoted his adult life to serving. He believed in it the way a person who reorganized their entire world around something believes in it. And then he looked. At the books. At the pencil marks. At the faces of anointed men describing how they learned about God's new revelation from a magazine that showed up in an envelope. At the ground beneath his feet and what was going into it. He reported what he found. He accepted what that cost him. He built something on the other side of the loss. And the documentation of what was buried at Wallkill, chemical and otherwise, remains in the public record of New York State, patient and available, waiting for the next person who decides to stop looking away. The Watchtower Society has always asked one thing of its members above everything else: do not look. William Morgan looked, and this is what he found.